I note that a quorum is present. I note for the subcommittee that Mrs. Sparks of Indiana is permitted to participate in today's hearing with the understanding that her questions will come only after members of the Health Subcommittee on both sides of the aisle who are present have had an opportunity to question the witnesses. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on lower drug costs now, expanding access to affordable health care. This is an entirely remote hearing. All microphones will be kept muted as a general rule to avoid unnecessary background noise. Members and witnesses will be responsible for unmuting themselves when they are recognized by the chair to speak or when they wish to seek recognition. I also ask that members please identify themselves before they speak. Members should keep their cameras on while in the proceeding. Members shall be considered present in the proceeding when they are visible on camera, and they shall be considered not present when they are not visible on camera. The only exception to this is if they are experiencing technical difficulty and inform committee staff of such difficulty. If any member experiences technical difficulties during the hearing, you should stay connected on the platform, make sure you are muted, and use your phone to immediately call a committee system administrator whose number has been provided in advance. Should the chair experience technical difficulty, Mr. Courtney, the distinguished gentleman from Connecticut, or another majority member is hereby authorized to assume the gavel in the chair's absence. Again, this is an entirely remote hearing, and as such, the committee's hearing room is officially closed. Members who choose to sit with their individual devices in the hearing room must wear headphones to avoid feedback, echoes, and distortion resulting from more than one person on the software platform sitting in the same room. Members are also expected to adhere to social distancing and safe healthcare guidelines, including the use of masks, hand sanitizer, and wiping down their areas both before and after their presence in the hearing room. In order to ensure that the committee's 5-minute rule is adhered to, staff will be keeping track of time using the committee's field timer. The field timer will appear in its own thumbnail picture and will be named 001 timer. There will be no 1 minute remaining time warning. The field timer will show a blinking light when your time is up. Members and witnesses are asked to wrap up promptly when their time has expired. While a roll call is not necessary to establish a quorum in official proceedings conducted remotely or with remote participation, the committee has made it a practice whenever there is an official proceeding with remote participants for the clerk to call the roll to help make clear who is present at the start of the proceeding. Members should say their name before announcing they are present. This helps the clerk and also helps those who are watching the platform in the live stream who may experience a few seconds delay. At this time, I will ask the clerk to call the roll.
Desaulniers.
Here.
Mr. Courtney.
I'm here.
Mr. Norcross.
Here.
Mr. Morelli. Ms. Wild. Mrs. McBath. Ms. Stevens. Mr. Levin. Mr. Mervan. Mr. Scott.
Mr. Scott is present.
Ranking Member Allen.
Allen present. Sorry about mute button.
Mr. Wilson.
Present.
Mr. Wahlberg.
Wahlberg present.
Mr. Banks. Mrs. Harshbarger.
Harshbarger present.
Mrs. Miller. Ms. Miller, could you repeat yourself? Okay. Mr. Fitzgerald,
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I got you. I'm here.
Miller, present.
Mrs. Miller, I have you recorded. Thank you. And Mrs. Fox.
Fox is present.
Thank you. Chairman Desaulnier, that concludes the roll call.
Thank you. Pursuant to
Chairman Desaulnier, I just want to know, I'm here, Macbeth is here, I'm present.
Thank you, Ms. Macbeth.
Thank you.
Welcome. Okay. Pursuant to Committee Rule 8C, opening statements are limited to the chair and the ranking member. This allows us to hear from witnesses sooner and provides all members with adequate time to ask questions. I now recognize myself for the purpose of making an opening statement. Welcome everyone to this important subcommittee hearing. Good morning. We are here, at least good morning on the West Coast. We are here today to discuss the cost of prescription medication and how lowering drug prices would support workers and strengthen the American economy. It has been more than a year since the House first passed the Elijah E. Cummings Lower Drug Costs Now Act to reduce out of control participation drug costs. Yet on top of weathering the worst global health crisis in recent history, Americans are still paying far too much for the medication they need. Robert from my district reached out to my office just recently when his monthly cost of his HIV medication that keeps him alive went from $130 to $960 per month. And of course, unfortunately, Robert is not alone. Each year, the prices of hundreds of drugs increased faster than the rate of inflation. Today, annual per capita spending on prescription drugs in the United States is more than $1,200. And the total out-of-pocket costs that consumers pay for drugs is more than $80 billion a year. These unaffordable prices have significant real-world consequences. Even in 2008, 3 in 10 adults decided to forego their prescribed medication due to the prohibitive cost. This is particularly frustrating given that these are not the prices that consumers in the rest of the world pay. Americans routinely pay 3 to 4 times, sometimes a dozen times more than what patients in other countries pay for the exact same drug. In fact, the cancer drug that keeps me alive, that I take for my chronic lymphocytic leukemia, that, as I said, is chronic, but is treatable, thank goodness, my drug cost $500 per day, ibrutinib. I'm grateful, obviously, for this drug, but I wonder why in Australia, the same diagnosis provides the exact same prescription drug for less than $30 a month. $500 in the United States, less than $30 in Australia. But the high cost of drug prices doesn't hurt just consumers. It also costs our nation's businesses, which sponsors the health coverage of approximately 150 million Americans. These plans spent nearly $84 billion on drugs in 2016 alone. And this price tag is only expected to grow unless we act. Some of my colleagues may argue that high drug prices are needed to cover the cost of research and developing and deploying new drugs. Yet we know that most drug companies spend more on marketing, sales, and overhead than they do on research and development. No one, myself included, obviously, wants to stop the wonderful innovation and deployment of life-saving drugs like the one I take. However, we must consider an appropriate return on investment that incentivizes the private sector and continues to support the important development of drugs at the NIH with public tax dollars, and also with the Department of Defense, in the Department of Defense and DARPA. Profits for drug companies are among the highest of any sector. According to the GAO, the average profit margin for a large drug company is between 15 and 20% after taxes, compared to the average large company's margin in other sectors, which is somewhere between 4 and 10%. While drug companies focus on their bottom line, the vast majority of new life-saving drugs are developed thanks, as I said, to taxpayer-funded medical research, like the important work happening today at the National Institutes for Health. In fact, every drug that was approved by the FDA in 2010 through 2016 was developed at least in part with NIH-supported research. Investing in research is vital to developing new cures and technologies, but we need fair drug prices at the other end so that consumers can actually realize these investments and save their lives and promote their health. That is why people across the political spectrum and across the country have made clear that they want Congress to rein in prescription drug prices. The Lower Drug Costs Now Act takes bold steps to lower the cost of drugs and increase transparency. First, it finally allows the Secretary of Health and Human Services to negotiate directly with drug companies to get fair prices for those in Medicare. Second, the bill makes the lower drug prices negotiated by Medicare available to consumers with private health coverage, including those covered with employer-sponsored plan. This will not only cut costs for workers covered by employer-provided health care, it will cut costs for employees as well. Third, the legislation caps negotiated drug prices to align with prices charged in similar countries, ensuring that Americans are no longer price gouged at the pharmacy counter. Fourth, the bill sets a new limit on out-of-pocket drug costs for Medicare beneficiaries and ends unfair annual price hikes by prescription drug companies for 8,000 drugs. And finally, the Lower Drug Costs Now Act takes advantage of the savings from negotiating lower drug prices by reinvesting that savings back into research to find new medical breakthroughs. As President Biden reminded us in his address to Congress last week, we've talked about lowering the cost of prescription drugs for long enough, Democrats and Republicans. It's time to finally deliver on our promise to ensure that all Americans can get the medication they need to stay healthy and thrive. I now recognize the distinguished ranking member for the purpose of making an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When the Trump administration launched Operation Warp Speed in May of 2020, they did so with a bold mission to develop a COVID-19 vaccine by the end of the year. 7 months later, healthcare workers lined up to receive their first dose of the Pfizer vaccine. To date, over 100 million adults are vaccinated against COVID-19. This life-saving scientific, technological, and logistical feat demonstrates just how powerful, innovative, and effective the American healthcare system can be. Unfortunately, many Americans are facing skyrocketing healthcare costs because of dramatic increases in out-of-pocket costs of prescription drugs. In 2018, patients paid a collective $61 billion in out-of-pocket drug costs. Fortunately, Republicans are stepping up with solutions that work best for the people without the heavy hand of government interference. H.R. 19, the Lower Cost, More Cures Act, introduced last month by Republican committee leaders, is the exact opposite of H.R. 3, Pelosi's big government power grab. The Lower Cost, More Cares Act will utilize the power of the free market to modernize our healthcare system, increase choice and transparency, and lower cost. These are goals that both sides of the aisle should be able to rally behind and focus on. All the provisions in H.R. 19 are bipartisan, workable, and ready to become law. We have the power to save lives and ease the minds of Americans struggling to pay for needed medications. Up until 2019, congressional efforts to lower drug prices for the American people were a collaborative effort and bipartisan effort. That changed when Speaker Pelosi wrote the Democrats' devastating drug pricing plan, H.R. 3, behind closed doors and without any Republican input. This year, the Democrats are doubling down on H.R. 3, radical legislation, which would have a devastating effect on drug development and innovation in the United States. After the Council of Economic Advisors found that H.R. 3 would lead to 100 fewer drugs entering the marketplace, Republican leader McCarthy said it best. H.R. 3 is a step toward nationalizing the drug industry and opening the door to one-size-fits-all government-controlled rationing of prescription drugs. Once again, Democrats are pushing far-left politics over policy by rushing through a harmful partisan bill. According to the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, H.R. 3 would significantly decrease private investment in research and development. Messenger RNA, the technology used to make the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, took billions of dollars of private investment over 3 decades to develop. Had this bill been law before the pandemic, the speedy development of Moderna and Pfizer vaccines would likely not have been possible. Countries around the world are benefiting from this life-saving technology because the Senate refused to pass the Democrat socialist healthcare scheme. You'd think that would give the my Democrat colleagues pause. Instead, Democrats are again trying to pass a partisan scheme that would increase our reliance on Chinese medical manufacturing, reduce our capacity for innovation, and devalue people with disabilities and chronic illnesses. Over half the Democrats in the U.S. House of Representatives support Medicare for All, a government-run single-payer healthcare system that would cost $32 trillion and eliminate private insurance, including employer-sponsored coverage, which benefits 159 million Americans and is the jurisdiction of this committee. By contrast, 71% of Americans say they are satisfied with their employer-sponsored healthcare coverage. Now, Democrats want to pass this harmful bill to move Americans in employer-sponsored plans to Medicare, bringing us even closer to a socialist single-payer system. This should be common sense, but kicking Americans off their health care plan will not increase their access to affordable medical care. It will do the opposite. At the end of the day, H.R. 3 would only lead to fewer treatments and cures, decreased competition in the marketplace, and an increased reliance on communist China. Unfortunately, the hearing today is being held to promote this radical scheme. Rather than promote partisan socialist policies such as H.R. 3, I urge my colleagues to work together on finding a bipartisan solution to lowering drug costs, like the common sense provisions in H.R. 19. I thank all the witnesses for joining us here today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Allen, and I will say my door is always open. Without objection, all other members who wish to insert written statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically in Microsoft Word format by 5 p.m. on May 19th, 2021. I will now introduce the witnesses and then recognize them for their 5 minutes, and then we'll go to questions. First, Dr. Mariana Sokol is assistant scientist at the Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg School of Public Health. She is a medical doctor by training and a researcher with expertise in prescription drug costs. Next will be David Mitchell, is founder and president of Patients for Affordable Drugs. He is a cancer patient and an advocate for lower drug costs. Dr. Douglas Holtz-Eakin is president of the American Action Forum, an economist by training. He is the former director of the Congressional Budget Office. Frederick Isayassi is executive director of Families USA. He is a leading advocate for healthcare consumers on a wide range of issues. We appreciate the witnesses for participating today and very much look forward to your testimony. Let us remind the witnesses that we have read your statements, your written statements, and they will appear in full in the hearing record. Pursuant to Committee Rule 8D and committee practice, each of you is asked to limit your oral presentation to a 5-minute summary of your written statement. Before you begin your testimony, please remember to unmute your microphone when you're recognized. During your testimony, staff will be keeping track of time and a timer will show at a blinking light when time is up. Please be attentive to the time, wrap up when your time is over, and remute your microphone. If any of you experience a technical problem during your testimony or later in the hearing, you should stay connected on the platform, make sure you are muted, and use your phone to immediately call a committee's system administrators, whose number was provided to you in advance. We will let all witnesses make their presentations before we move to members' questions. When answering a question, please remember to unmute your microphone. The witnesses are aware of their responsibility to provide accurate information to the subcommittee, and therefore we will proceed now with their testimony. First recognize Dr. Sokol. Dr. Sokol, the floor is yours.
Chairman DeSaulnier, Ranking Member Allen, and members of the committee, it is a great honor to be speaking with you today. The last few years, I have received funding to work with several large organizations that are attempting to control drug spending. These include the Purchaser Business Group on Health, PBGH, and ERIC, the ERISA Industry Committee. I also received funding from Arnold Ventures. I've done extensive research examining the drug benefits that self-insured employers from school districts to America's largest corporations offer to their workers. Today, about 1/3 of all Americans are covered by employers' self-sponsored health plans. These self-insured employers typically hire a pharmacy benefit manager, a PBM, to negotiate drug prices on their behalf. The PBM negotiates with drug manufacturers by offering to cover a drug more favorably in exchange for a lower price. When the PBM can pick between multiple products, the one that it will cover, then the market works. When a drug has no competition because there's no alternatives, then manufacturers will not lower their price and the negotiation will fail. For drugs without competition, the US pays 3 to 4 times higher prices than other countries. For these drugs, a different type of negotiation is greatly needed, and the approach adopted by HR3 can offer a successful alternative. My colleagues and I examined the top spending drugs in Medicare Part D and found that if the US paid the average price across the countries that we studied, Medicare Part D alone could have saved about $73 billion in 2018. Employer savings would be similar. The drugs with the largest price differential compared to other countries are not the new drugs, but the drugs that have been in the US market for a long period of time. While drug prices in other countries tend to go down over time, drug prices in the US continuously increase. Just this January, a record number of more than 800 drugs raised their US prices. 99.9% of them were branded drugs, and most of them had also increased their prices in recent years. US insurers, especially very large employers, like to think that they're getting the best possible deals in drug pricing, but it's very hard for employers to know how much they're actually paying for a drug. The net price after all rebates and discounts can only be known weeks or months after the drug bill has been paid, and there's very little transparency in this process. The negotiation proposed in HR3 would provide employers with a transparent maximum price. Alternatively, employers could opt out of this price and choose the deal that is best for them. Patients have no idea why drugs cost so much. For patients, lower and transparent prices would really reduce what they must pay. Patients' cost sharing is typically based on the list price set by the drug company. As a result, most patients do not benefit from these prices that PBMs have negotiated on their employer's behalf when they pay their cost share. Having a transparent and lower drug price allows all patients to benefit directly from the negotiations. This is especially important for the 30% of American workers who are enrolled in a high deductible health plan. These workers, they pay the drug's full cost until they meet their deductible. HR3 allows the secretary to negotiate on behalf of all Americans, and the more people included in the negotiation, the greater the negotiating power and the greater the ability to get lower prices. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw an example of how negotiation can work when the secretary negotiates drug prices. The secretary negotiated prices for antiviral remdesivir, for example, and then made these prices available to private hospitals who would then directly purchase the drug. These negotiations were possible in a very extreme situation. The drug was urgently needed and there was absolutely no competition available. The secretary was able to guarantee the purchase of a certain quantity of the drug, even if private hospitals were the ones really in charge of actually purchasing the drug. This is a very useful model for price negotiations of drugs that don't have competition but have a great public health interest. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Doctor. We'll now go to Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell, the floor is yours.
Chairman DeSaulnier, Ranking Member Allen, members of the committee. I'm David Mitchell. I'm founder of Patients for Affordable Drugs. More importantly, like you, Mr. Chairman, I have an incurable blood cancer, and prescription drugs are keeping me alive. My doctors have me on a 4-drug combination right now with a list price of more than $900,000 per year. Just one of my oral drugs, called Pomalyst, is priced at more than $20,000 for 21 capsules. And because Medicare beneficiaries like me pay our cost based on list price, I spent more than $18,000 out of pocket last year just for Pomalyst. For people with my cancer, multiple myeloma, drugs account for 60% of the cost of treatment. I'm a very lucky man. These drugs are keeping my cancer at bay, but eventually this combination is going to stop working, and I'll need a new treatment. So I care deeply about innovation and new drug development. But drugs don't work if people can't afford them. Drugs are too expensive in the US with no justification. When drug makers hike prices each year, they don't do it because the drug is more valuable. Drug companies raise prices because they can. As a result, Americans pay almost 4 times what other wealthy nations pay for the exact same drugs. Nearly 40% of Americans say it's difficult to afford their medications. 90% of voters across both parties say it's extremely important that Congress take action on drug pricing. Now, of course, Biopharma opposes any reforms that would curb its unilateral power to dictate prices. So it threatens that reforms will destroy innovation and access to new drugs. But these claims don't hold up. Here are 4 reasons why. 1, Biopharma enjoys profits that are almost 3 times the average of the S&P 500. Brand name drug companies could lose $1 trillion in sales over 10 years and remain the most profitable industry in the US. 2, a huge amount of R&D is coming from taxpayers. NIH-funded research is associated with every new drug approved by the FDA from 2010 to 2019. COVID vaccines illustrate this point. The unprecedented speed of vaccine development was enabled by more than $17 billion of NIH-funded research on vaccine technologies prior to the pandemic. A new method of developing vaccines was waiting to be tested. Then the government invested another $18 billion for clinical trials to stand up production, spending whatever was necessary and eliminating financial risks. 3, CBO says we could cut pharma revenue by up to $1 trillion over 10 years and lose only 8 of 300 new drugs. And many of those 8 wouldn't be losses because only 10 to 15% of new drugs represent true therapeutic advances. 4, Big Pharma threatens that patients will lose early access to drugs. But drug companies file for approval first in the US because we have the highest prices and the largest market in the world. Given that US prices for brand drugs are almost 4 times what other wealthy nations pay, we can lower prices and still offer the highest prices by far in the largest market in the world. Congress must act. H.R. 3 is the comprehensive reform we need. It will lower prices, rein in price gouging, and reduce out-of-pocket costs. Now, it's estimated to save the federal government over $450 billion. Big Pharma complains that redeploying these savings to address other critical needs is tantamount to using the industry as a piggy bank. But in reality, it's pharma that has treated patients and taxpayers as piggy banks for years, raising prices at will to hit profit targets and trigger executive bonuses. Pharma is right about one thing. America does have other priorities, and every dollar we send to pharma in unjustified profits is a dollar we don't have to reduce healthcare disparities, provide healthcare to the uninsured, or increase NIH research on drugs for rare diseases like mine. H.R. 3 enjoys 93% bipartisan support. It's time to pass it. Of course, it's an uphill fight against a powerful lobby, let's be clear. Big Pharma is not fighting for the interests of patients. Recently, the head of Pharma, the trade association, affirmed that fact. He said his industry is, quote, adept at rolling the tanks to push back against policy proposals adverse to the industry's interests. So you must choose a side. Stand with patients and taxpayers, or stand with pharma to protect the industry's interests. But let's be honest, that's what this fight is about. It's about restoring balance to ensure we get the innovation we need at prices we can afford. You hold the power to make the changes the American people are demanding. We're going to do our part to make sure their voices are heard. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. Next up is Dr. Holtz Eakin. Doctor, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Chairman DeSonia, Ranking Member Allen, and members of the subcommittee. It's a privilege to be here today to discuss this very important topic. I'd like to make 3 brief points, and then I look forward to the opportunity to answer your questions. Point number 1 is that there's no evidence of a broad-based, pervasive drug pricing problem in the United States that would merit a sweeping one-size-fits-all solution. As I laid out in my written testimony, if you look at a variety of measures of price, list price, net price, cost out of pocket to a beneficiary, look across beneficiaries and look across drugs, on the whole, there is no real evidence of a sharp uptick in prices that would merit a strong policy response. There are, in fact, select individuals and drugs for which there is a severe financial problem, but that suggests the right response is a targeted solution in those circumstances and that the committee should be focused on those. So this data really do suggest that you focus on increasing the supply. Anytime you have a high price, you need to look at the supply of drugs for those targeted situations. Point number 2 is that the provisions in Title I of H.R. 3 are hardly a negotiation and are in fact collectively a threat to the dynamic, innovative ecosystem of the U.S. pharmaceutical industry. It's not a negotiation. The Congressional Budget Office has repeatedly, beginning with my tenure, informed the Congress that giving the Secretary the power to negotiate would produce little, if any, in the way of budgetary savings for the federal government. And the reason is quite simple. The Secretary doesn't have at his or her disposal a formulary or other lever to negotiate effectively with pharmaceutical manufacturers. The plans and PBMs that negotiate in Part D do have those tools and negotiate very effectively. The difference between those findings and those CBO findings for H.R. 3 thus lie in the tax provisions in H.R. 3 and the international reference prices, the average international market price provisions of that legislation. The tax provisions are real simple. There's a draconian 95% revenue tax that is simply a threat to the existence of the drug on the domestic market and is tantamount to asking the company to withdraw that drug. This raises the fundamental issue of access to therapies that is so important to Americans, and that tax is there to ration those therapies. The average international market price is an arbitrary price ceiling being set by the federal government. It's not a negotiated or market-based price, and it also threatens access to drugs. If you look at the reference countries underneath that average index market price, you do find less access to pharmaceuticals. They're on the market slower. They're on in the US in about 4 months. They're on much slower in those other countries. Almost 90% of brand name drugs will be on the US market. At best, 60% will be on in reference countries. Sometimes it's only a third. And so there's a fundamental trade-off there, whether you're going to pay in the form of financial costs or in lack of access to important therapies. Point number 3 is that if you want to do something on drug prices, I would propose instead that you look at the reforms to the Medicare Part D benefit in H.R. 19. Medicare Part D has been an enormously successful entitlement program, as I lay out in my testimony. However, you could sharpen the incentives for better negotiation by making manufacturers and plans liable for more of the costs in the catastrophic region and thus reduce the incentive to have high-priced drugs that push individuals into that region. You can save the taxpayer an increasing bill that comes with the reinsurance in the catastrophic region. And by capping out-of-pockets, you can improve the benefit for beneficiaries. An already popular and successful benefit would be even more suitable for American seniors. So that, I think, is a better route to go. Part D accounts for 25% of drug spending in the United States. It's a very important lever for improving private negotiations and market incentives to deliver pharmaceuticals at a reasonable cost. So that, I think, is a route you ought to consider and steer away from Title I, which I think will, in the end, do more damage than good. But thank you for the chance to be here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Appreciate your testimony. Finally, we'll hear from Mr. Isesa. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Chairman DeSaulnier, Ranking Member Allen, Chairman Scott, and Ranking Member Fox, and all the members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm Frederick Asasi, the Executive Director of Families USA, We're a nonpartisan nonprofit that for over 40 years has served as one of the leading national voices for healthcare consumers, both in Washington, D.C. and on the state level. Thank you very much for holding this hearing on lowering drug costs. What an incredibly important issue, and one that is so wildly popular with your constituents. Stopping prescription drug abuses is the #1 healthcare issue for voters across this nation. And despite all of the division in our nation's politics right now, Americans are united on this issue. The vast majority of Americans want action right now on this issue, and the majorities of voters in both parties want the government to get in there and negotiate prices. As you've heard, millions of Americans live with the fear of not being able to afford their prescriptions, and 1/3 of Americans are not taking their prescriptions because they are too expensive. Of these, more than 2/3 are engaging in the terrible gamble of either skipping doses or cutting their pills in half. Year after year, prescription drug companies launch drugs here in the US, and as you've heard, charge 3 or 4 times more than in other countries. And then in their greed, they raise these outrageous prices much faster than either our paychecks or inflation. In fact, a record-setting 900 drugs have seen abusive increases in prices since January of this year. The American people need relief. This is happening in red states and blue states, for families in Richmond, California, or in Savannah, Georgia. The drug industry makes a lot of false arguments, and at its core, the problem of out-of-control drug prices is very simple. Congress created a system that provides government-granted monopoly to drug makers, and many within the industry are abusing these federal laws. Let me explain what I mean. Over time, so much of the industry's focus has shifted from creating innovative drugs that can save lives to doubling down on high-powered lawyers to help find loopholes, sue competitors, and generally abuse the spirit in which federal prescription drug laws were created. That adds up to a crisis for families and hundreds of billions of dollars in waste. We at Families USA are strongly supportive of H.R. 3, the Elijah E. Cummings Lower Drug Costs Act, which represents a critical step in addressing the crisis of prescription drug cost. It represents bold and wildly popular action that would allow the government to defend our families and negotiate directly with drug manufacturers to curb abusive prices. The bill uses savings and reduced drug costs to invest in research and development for new cures, as well as reducing out-of-pocket costs for Medicare beneficiaries. It also could support much-needed improvements in the Medicare program, such as dental, hearing, and vision benefits, and support for low-income Medicare beneficiaries. So what will the fate of this important and wildly popular legislation be? On the other side of this fight is one of the most profitable and concentrated industries in the world, with revenues in excess of $1 trillion. And half of its profits are generated in the US and Canada alone. An industry spending at least $133 million just to lobby Congress. All of you, with over 800 lobbyists in DC, you are all under tremendous pressure. Let me tell you about a remarkable woman we have met through our work at Families USA, who perhaps can steady your resolve to get this legislation enacted. Her name is Maureen. She's 80 years old and living in a small house in the beautiful mountains of North Georgia. Her retirement dream had been to care for abused and neglected animals through an animal rescue. Maureen depends on Medicare for her health insurance and Social Security for her income. Like so many millions of Americans at her stage in life, Maureen lives check to check. She's taken care of herself over the years and describes herself as very healthy. Unfortunately, as she aged, Maureen developed blood clots in her leg and lungs that threatened her life. To save her health, Maureen was prescribed anti-blood clotting medication. She will need to be on this treatment for the rest of her life, and Maureen is required to pay $400 every 3 months just in cost sharing for this treatment. And at that price, Maureen simply cannot make ends meet. So Maureen has given up all of the non-essential expenses in her life. She's given up almost all the driving to save on gas and maintenance costs. She can't afford to go to the dentist, but that still isn't enough. And so Maureen tells us that she's made the incredibly heart-wrenching decision to cut back on food. Maureen is limiting herself to eating 1 meal a day. And when hunger sets in, she drinks water because it fills her up. These are the impossible trade-offs people are making as a result of our broken system. An 80-year-old woman has made the decision to give up food to pay for prescriptions. It's unconscionable. Maureen is a survivor and she's resigned. But in her own words, Funding big
Good wrap
pharma
up,
is
Steve.
not in my Social Security budget plan, and here I am. Congress created the problem of out-of-control drug prices, and time for action is long past due. Thank you for holding the hearing. Thank you again for inviting Families USA to be here. To the committee members, I say, let's get this done. Let's send the Lower Drug Prices Now Act to the president. It would be a
Thank you.
tremendous political victory for the entire Congress and change the lives of Maureen and millions of others.
Thank you. We thank all of the testimony. And again, please try to stay within your allotted time. Thank you for your articulate expressions. Now, under committee rule 9A, we will go to questions of witnesses under the 5-minute rule. I will be recognizing subcommittee members in seniority order. Again, to ensure that members' 5-minute rule is adhered to, staff will be keeping track of time, and the timer will show a blinking light when time has expired. Please be attentive to the time, wrap up when your time is over, and remute your microphone. As chair, I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Mitchell, you and I have a lot in common. In addition to the life-saving drugs that we both get, your numbers, I thought my numbers were astronomical. Yours clearly are really even more so. And as you, I'm grateful for them and grateful for the investment that created them and keep me alive. One of the things that I've struggled with both as a client, a payer, and as a taxpayer is, what's the best formula? What's the cost benefit? How do we attract private sector funding, but also recognize and continue to invest in taxpayer funding so that we get these life-saving drugs? In your view, I have 2 questions. You also were a small business person, as was I. Always think it's funny when I'm associated with radical socialism by some of my friends. As a former Republican small business owner who owned a restaurant named after Teddy Roosevelt, my kids would be shocked to hear me described as a radical socialist. So in this bill, in HR 3, Mr. Mitchell, tell me how that would help clients like you and I reduce the cost of our life-saving drugs, but not inhibit these investments. And I am of the mind that I'm afraid that American payers and taxpayers are subsidizing, for instance, in my drug, the $500 I pay goes to subsidize the lower price for Australians with the same diagnosis. And then secondly, as a former small business person, describe some of the pressures that you are under to provide health insurance for your employees when the cost was so exorbitant.
Mr. Chairman, first of all, I'm sorry that we share the experience of having cancer. I'm glad, very glad that both of us have drugs that are working right now. I believe it's important for us to have an approach to setting drug prices where we incentivize the development of the most valuable new drugs. Drugs that carry high value should get a high price. A drug that cures my cancer, which should command a very high price, because there isn't one that will do that, or a drug that treats Alzheimer's effectively. So I want a system that incentivizes investment in drugs that will make a difference and meet unmet needs. And we need to make sure that we're sending enough money to NIH to focus on drugs that are public health priorities, not necessarily private profit priorities. I ran a business for almost 30 years. It is very difficult when the cost of healthcare goes up to absorb it if you run on tight margins. And what you wind up doing is either you pay people less money because you have to send it to pay for the more expensive drugs, or you shift costs onto them. And in fact, the ERISA Industry Committee issued a statement yesterday saying it wasn't very fond of the Republican alternative, HR 19, because it includes a number of policies that just shift costs to employers. So we have to be very careful what we do as we try to tackle this problem.
Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. Dr. Sokal, let's talk a little bit about where the money is going to. So the United States, as I understand it, is the only country, along with New Zealand, that allows television advertising for prescription drugs. Could you talk a little bit about the amount of money that pharmaceutical industry spends on marketing and sales, as opposed to what they spend on research and development? And do other countries have the same formula?
Thank you for this question. Yes, 9 out of the 10 biggest pharmaceutical manufacturers are spending more on marketing and advertisement than on research and development for drugs. And of course, it is the drugs that have the highest prices that can invest more on advertisement. And that is only allowed in the United States. In New Zealand, we are the only exceptions in the global market that allow manufacturers to advertise directly to consumers. Everybody else believes that physicians are the ones who know when a drug works, and physicians can be trusted to prescribe these drugs to consumers. We are really an exception on that side.
Dr. Sokol, are you familiar with any research that attempts to quantify what the right formula is? So what's a reasonable rate of return for private sector's investors? And how do we identify the base level of research or more that taxpayers pay for that come out of the NIH?
What we really want is real innovation, and not innovation about me too drugs that are just copies of everything else that is already available.
It'd be really helpful to get those kind of numbers, so we could have a more rational, constructive conversation, I think, across the aisle, because I do think we all want the same thing. We want to make sure Americans get this innovation, but we want to make sure there's a reasonable rate of return to attract those investments, not an exorbitant rate of return.
Absolutely.
With that, I will end my questioning and turn it over to the ranking member, my good friend, Mr. Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the benefit of our committee members, I'm going to defer to the end, if I may, and we can go to our next most senior member, if that's okay.
That's fine. And
Mr. Chairman, I believe that this is Congresswoman Fox. I believe I was to be recognized next.
Okay, I didn't have that information. I would be delighted to recognize you, Virginia. Ms. Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I feel very positive about you, and I'm glad you're there. I thank all our witnesses for being here today. Dr. Holtz-Eakin, in addition to importing foreign price controls and setting prices for some drugs in Medicare, H.R. 3 gives employer-sponsored plans the quote-unquote choice to participate in this government price-setting system. I put choice in quotation marks because employers are not presented with a choice. Not only does H.R. 3 force employers into the Democrat drug pricing scheme, but it also punishes those who wish to opt out and negotiate prices on their own. Do you think H.R. 3 provides fair choices to employers and the plan participants? What are the consequences for employers who choose to opt out?
Well, thank you for the question, Dr. Fox. I don't think H.R. 3 represents genuine negotiation either between the Secretary and manufacturers or with ERISA employers having the opportunity to negotiate on their own. So this is really a very sweeping proposed legislation that affects every third-party payer in the United States and sweeps them into a price-fixing regime that I think will have really negative impacts on the U.S. and on its citizens. So I just want to emphasize some things that have been said that I really think don't get appreciated. Number one, the idea that we should concentrate on a reasonable rate of return is a sensible idea, but it has to be risk adjusted. 1 in 1,000 pharmaceutical formulas gets to a trial. Of those, 8% get approved by the FDA. This is as risky a business as you can imagine. And after the fact, some returns look high for that reason and that reason alone. So it has to take into account those risks. Second thing is that if we're going to have the NIH pick drugs, which ones are they going to do? They have to pick from all those too. At least the private sector is losing their own money when they take a drug that doesn't work out. And the idea of Me Too drugs being a bad idea, that's what competition is. That's how it's generated. When Sovaldi came on the market as the only cure for Hep C, it immediately was followed by 2 other Me Too cures for Hep C, which drove the price down by 50%. So the only solution for high prices is better competition. And the idea that somehow the NIH is going to generate competition, or they're eliminating Me Too drugs as the solution, is really mistaken.
You mentioned in your opening statement that employers are now able to negotiate price reductions without the government interfering in the commercial market. I think we understand it, but what would you say about how these negotiations benefit employees?
Well, if you're negotiating with a drug company and you have the capacity to move large amounts of their products at a preferable price, you get a better deal. And that's the kind of incentives that you want in the system. Those are the incentives that were underneath the original design of Medicare Part D. And as I noted in my remarks, it would be a good idea to sharpen those incentives even further at this point in time. They've eroded somewhat. That's the route to getting prices down. Provide competition and strong negotiations and allow increased supply wherever possible.
Great. I have two more questions, and the chairman has asked us to be within our time. Dr. Holtz-Eakin, employer sponsors of group health plans are required by law to administer their plans in the best interest of their employees. However, HR 3 could create conditions that place employers in difficult positions and expose them to unnecessary legal risk. Can you explain briefly why this could very well happen and what would be the consequence to employers?
Sure. The array of provisions that lead to the maximum fair price, quote, negotiated by the secretary, would be available to those employers. They could also try out to go out and negotiate on their own, but if they can't guarantee that they're going to get a lower price, it might not be in their fiduciary interest to do so. They would have to take the arbitrarily set government price.
Thanks. One more question. Health plans use a formulary list of covered drugs selected by the plan to help manage costs, especially when it comes to specialty drugs. How will HR 3 affect the drugs included in the formulary? Will employees and their families still have access to new and innovative treatments?
My deepest fear is that we will in fact inhibit innovation in the United States. It has happened in other countries. I mean, Germany used to be the center of medical science on the globe. It's not a God-given right. They adopted bad policies, and the United States is now that place. If we adopt bad policies, we can lose that innovative sector, and we can not have the next generation of therapies.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back within time.
Thank you, Dr. Fox. You get a gold star. Next, I want to recognize the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Mitchell, I want to again thank you also for correcting the record regarding, or just adjusting the record regarding the discovery of the COVID vaccine. Actually, just 3 weeks ago, the U.S. Patent Office awarded the NIH a patent on the spiked protein technology, which Pfizer and Moderna used to basically come up with their iterations of a vaccine. Again, the taxpayer took a lot of the risk out of the research that went in. And again, as you point out, that actually preceded the outbreak of the virus. I think almost every other member on this subcommittee, with all the COVID relief bills that we voted on, going back to the original, even pre-CARES Act, billions were approved on a bipartisan basis, which for all of us, I think should, feel good about in terms of, trying to accelerate and create the warp speed mechanism that, again, was a great success. And the companies who were involved in that, kudos to them. But, it is clear that the taxpayer and NIH were instrumental, even to the point of having legal ownership. And Mr. Chairman, I would ask that the patent notice be admitted to the record. Again, just to confirm the government and the taxpayers' role in terms of getting us to the vaccine.
Without objection.
Thank you. And Ms. Sokol, I speak a lot to the Connecticut Insurance Department. We have a regulated insurance market where rates are approved on both the individual market and the business market. And last year, the insurance commissioner reported that the share of premiums that employers pay for prescription drugs is now at about 23% of premium dollar. If you go back really even just a few years ago, that was at 15%. So, do you see that trend in employer-sponsored plans? in terms of how much prescription drugs are driving the increase in premium.
Yes, we see that a lot. And not only increase in premiums, but really increases in the overall spending that patients make in their overall out-of-pocket costs as well.
So again, there are obviously a lot of other healthcare costs that go into the premium dollar, whether it's, hospital reimbursement, physician reimbursement. So again, it's really disproportionate in terms of, again, the trajectory that we're seeing right now, which really is why I think this bill, which sometimes when you talk about prescription drug costs, it's all sort of about Medicare. This bill is not just about Medicare. It's also about providing relief for employer-sponsored plans.
Absolutely. And a lot of what's driving these costs is these very high, very expensive drugs that really don't offer any additional value as compared to other alternatives that are in the market, but they're just increasing their prices, and that really unbeknownst to patients and often to physicians as well.
So again, as someone who was also a small employer at one time, I want to just sort of go back to this point about what the employer's sort of fiduciary responsibility, what his options are. Again, this bill does not mandate that an employer purchase a healthcare plan that has the government negotiated price, right? I mean, they still have an option to use market or PBMs or whatever to get their prescription drug coverage. Is that right?
They do have an option, and that option would bring really important transparency to this market, because even if a self-insured employer is hiring a PBM to negotiate on their behalf, oftentimes the employer does not even know exactly how much they're paying for drugs. There's an important lack of transparency there, and this bill would bring a lot of transparency back for employers to know what's best for them.
And transparency is really what is essential for market economics, isn't that correct?
It is crucial.
I mean, that's the irony of some of the rhetoric here, is that actually this bill actually provides a healthier marketplace, not a more restricted marketplace. Isn't that correct?
It is. And part of the lack of transparency is having so many intermediaries in our negotiations, and having a transparent benchmark will help employers to be able to even monitor the work of these intermediaries more effectively.
Well, thank you for your testimony. And Mr. Chairman, in the spirit of moving along, I yield back the balance of my time.
You get a gold star as well. You're with Dr. Fox, Mr. Courtney. And with that, the chair will recognize Mr. Wilson from South Carolina for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And indeed, Joe Courtney deserves a gold star. Additionally, I appreciate Ranking Member Rick Allen proceeding as we're doing today. And also, I want to ask a question to Dr. Holtz-Egan. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce has estimated, sadly, that in my home state of South Carolina, 4,401 jobs would be destroyed due to H.R. 3, the consequence of a big government power grab leading to delay and denial of medical care with lack of access. On top of that, the pensions and mutual funds hold a significant amount of biopharmaceutical shares on the S&P index. How do you see H.R. 3 affecting pension plans and retirement accounts in the short and long run?
Well, certainly in the short run, this would be a big negative for the market value of those holdings, and that would hurt the funding of those pensions plans. I think that's very straightforward. Over the longer term, fully implemented, this is a real negative for the entire sector, for the small startups that develop drugs and often sell them and always plan to sell them to larger pharmaceutical companies, and that value that has always been part of the system would dry up and disappear. And so over the long term, this would be negative as well. So I don't think there's any question about the impact of this. And I'm very sympathetic to the notion that, especially for specialty drugs right now, and a lot of those are oncology drugs, that prices are very high and that there's some severe financial distress for Mr. Mitchell and chairman and people like them who are kept alive by those drugs. They're an enormously expensive but valuable item. The irony is that although that's a very difficult situation, H.R. 3 would do nothing to make it better, would only make it worse. There would be no innovation to replace them with something that is pure or anything that is a competition that lowers the price. And I think that's the real concern.
Well, thank you for your analysis. And another question for you, Dr. Holtz-Egan. I'm grateful that Nephron Pharmaceuticals, a woman-owned business located in Lexington County, South Carolina, the president, CEO, and owner, Lou Kennedy, who's a real superstar in our community, recently announced a 240,000 square foot expansion to include 110,000 square foot vaccine production, chemotherapy, and antibiotic wing. This expansion is estimated to create 380 new jobs in our community. What kind of job reduction could occur within the pharmaceutical industry if HR 3 were enacted?
We would see fewer innovations. The CBO is on record as saying there'll be fewer innovative drugs. The Council of Economic Advisors estimated a larger number. Directionally, everyone knows the answer. The only question is how big is it? And that means that you don't build those factories and you don't hire those individuals.
And hey, I invite everybody to come visit. Nephron Pharmaceuticals is really very close to my house. And it's so exciting to see the number of cars in the parking lot. And also, Dr. Holtz-Eakin, through Operation Warp Speed with the leadership of former Vice President Mike Pence, we've seen the American ingenuity at its finest with the, as Ranking Member Rick Allen has accurately reviewed, with the incredible success of development. The United States should maintain that capability to avoid reliance on international competitors like China, which sadly disregard lawful practices. With China aggressively advancing their research and development capabilities, how do you see HR 3 impacting our capabilities in international competition?
I think it's an unambiguous negative for innovation. I've said that several times now. To the extent that the Chinese are plowing money into innovation and trying to compete on that front, it's a handicap. And I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone on this committee and in Congress on both sides of the aisle for Operation Warp Speed, for the funding that you provided. That was an extraordinary accomplishment. You know, the mRNA technology had been around for 3 decades. There've been a lot of private risk capital put in there for things that did not pay off. And in the end, by financing trials that overlapped and guaranteeing markets for the vaccine that was being manufactured, although not approved, you did something remarkable in conjunction with the private sector. And I think it was a great accomplishment.
Thank you very much for your insight, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Everybody's getting a gold star so far. You could. We'll now go to Mr. Norcross from New Jersey, and I'm certain he will get a gold star.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chairman, for holding this hearing. Dr. Holtze, help me understand something. I'm just backing up. You suggested that Germany used to be the most innovative place in the world and that they passed some regulations and they moved to the US as most innovative. Is that encapsulate what you were trying to get across?
Short version of a long argument, yes.
So does that mean now that the US has there, that Germany, you're not going to give any of the innovative drugs to them because you no longer are there?
No, I mean, I'm just saying that we have had a very effective system at nurturing innovation in pharmaceuticals.
Absolutely.
And elsewhere.
But you suggested Germany did also. They've lost it now because they passed some laws. So the first question is, so what did they lose? That innovation? You won't send them any of the new drugs?
It's not about where you send them. It's about what gets developed where. And I'm worried about what will
hold it. If it's developed, does that mean you're not going to share it with another country and put them on sale there?
That's not, I never said anything about where it was sold.
I'm asking.
It will be sold.
Guessing because they're not innovative, that they moved out and somehow they're not going to get those drugs. But I think you answered the question correctly. They will get those drugs. They might not get them the first day, but they're going to get them. Thank you. I appreciate your answer.
Actually, just for the record and
thank you.
Testimony.
I'll take my time. Thank you.
About 40% get them.
Sir,
Mr. Holtz, it's the member's time, please.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mr.
So cool. I used to be part of a local union and we took care of our health and welfare fund, trying to always save costs and be innovative. And then came along these pharmacy benefit managers. Sounded like the best thing since sliced bread. They promised us the world. And they did for a while. Now what we found out is that the negotiations that they're able to make are not transparent. We're not getting the benefit that we used to because that's not disclosed. Can you talk about the PBMs? What works well and what doesn't?
Sure. I fully agree with you. In the beginning, they were needed, especially with so many different new drugs entering the market. But the problem is that PBMs not only negotiate, but they also make a profit of the drugs that they do negotiate. So they make a cut, and it is on their best interest. Oftentimes, when they have two different options, one is lower cost and the other one is higher cost, it is on their best interest, oftentimes, to have the higher cost drug in the formulary so that they can make a higher cut of the price of that drug. And that's one of the reasons why the prices set by manufacturers are increasing so much today, where the prices that end up being negotiated have seemed to be oftentimes just stable or not growing as quickly. And for patients, this is very, very harmful because their cost sharing is paid over those prices set by the manufacturers. And the PBMs are simply making a cut while everybody is negotiating a lower price.
So just to understand, the PBMs came into existence because they could gather a larger group of customers, put them together and give you a better chance against the big pharma. So that worked. If we were to put transparency in there, would that go a long way to fixing that problem that you just suggested?
It would fix part of the problem, especially for these Me Too drugs. But another part of the problem is drugs that do not have any competition. They're not Me Too. They are very important. And I just gave an example today in my testimony. And for these drugs, the PBM cannot say no. They have nothing to compete this drug against and try to lower this drug price. And for these situations, the PBM negotiation model is just not successful.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back with 45 seconds left. Thanks.
Oh, those precious 45 seconds of your wisdom. We will now go to Mr. Wahlberg, the distinguished gentleman from Michigan.
You're a very kind chairman, and I say thank you for that. Thanks for the hearing. There's no question that healthcare costs are at the top of the minds for many Americans, myself included. And the cost of prescription drugs are a concern for workers and families. Sadly, instead of working on bipartisan solutions we all agree on, the bill we're discussing today seeks to impose radical price-setting policies that run the risk of decimating biopharmaceutical research and jobs. In Michigan, a state that is proudly producing the COVID-19 vaccine, 86,000 jobs are supported by the biopharmaceutical sector. Moreover, the bill will reduce necessary investment in research and development and access to breakthrough cures for difficult and rare diseases like Alzheimer's, childhood cancers, sickle cell anemia, to just name a few. We all have met families or know someone who have felt the devastation when a loved one has been diagnosed with a disease with no cure. So it's disappointing that we are here again, holding a hearing on this socialized agenda drug pricing scheme that would further dash the hopes of finding breakthrough cures, and I believe saving many, many lives. But we ought to talk about it. So here we are. And Dr. Holtz-Eakin, thank you for being here with the rest of your panel. You note in your testimony that it takes on average $2.9 billion and 15 years to bring a successful drug to market. And many drugs are never approved. How would putting the HHS secretary and Washington bureaucrats in charge of price setting add political risk to the already risky process of developing and delivering drug treatments to Americans?
It would add an enormous amount of risk. You'd be exposed to the starting point, which is the average indexed market price, international market price. That's something you don't know and was in the control of bureaucrats outside the United States. You would then have the secretary having the unilateral power to declare whether negotiations were in good faith or not, run the risk of getting the drug essentially taxed out of the domestic market entirely and having no revenue. Those are just recipes for increased risk and less capital flowing to that industry. And everyone always thinks the drug companies somehow are going to get in the fetal position and stop developing drugs. No, that's what they do, but then no one will give them the money, and that'll be the reality.
And that just makes common sense, which maybe is not all that common. Dr. Holtz-Eakin, we know that China is striving for a bigger footprint in biotechnology, as to be assumed. I'm concerned that the policies put forward in HR 3 would make the United States more reliant on other countries like China for research and development. Can you speak to what repercussions greater reliance on China for our medical breakthroughs would have on the United States?
I think there are two big concerns. Number one has been the well-noted issue of security of supply chains for those drugs that are already in production. And it is a sensible question to ask whether you want something in China or not. And if not, make sure that you have something that will survive some sort of stress test as a supply chain outside of China or in the US. And the second is, where will you go for innovative and important therapies that are not produced in the United States, but which our citizens would like to have? And that's a situation that I think people are increasingly find to be problematic as the Chinese continue to not play by international rules, trade on level terms with others, and thus violate their international obligations.
We've certainly seen that over the course of the last year, haven't we? Dr. Holtz-Eakin, you note in your testimony that the sweeping nature of the proposed reforms in HR 3 do not just apply to Medicare, but would also apply to plans operating under ERISA. If HR 3 becomes law, how would employer-sponsored health plans be impacted?
They end up in the same pricing regime. I don't see any way around it. I mean, the starting point's the average international market price that, that becomes the maximum. And then an ERISA employer could try to negotiate and get a lower price, but they've got their employees in their formula. The secretary has a 95% I will levy this and you're out of business club in their hand. There's no question the secretary is going to cut a better deal. It's just, this is not a negotiation. This is using the fiat power of the government to set prices.
I appreciate the response. Thank you, and I yield back 7 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Wahlberg. I appreciate that. We will now recognize, the chair will recognize the gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. Representative McBath. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. This is really great information and very insightful. As a two-time breast cancer survivor myself, and having been in, the system, so to speak, I know all too well, the stresses and all the heartache of the life-changing diagnosis when you get it. And then when you have it a second time, it's even more challenging. I know that my treatment was exhausting. It was both physically and emotionally exhausting. And I was truly, blessed to be able to afford my medications. And unfortunately, we know that that's not a reality for a lot of Americans. And in particular, under all of the additional stresses of COVID-19, I beg to I can't even imagine what it's been like for persons that have pre-existing conditions and have been suffering so. And at a time when, everyone is suffering so financially, lowering the cost of their prescription medications can really be a very vital lifeline. Time and time again, I talk to my constituents all the time, and they're telling me that the cost of their prescription drugs is, a top priority for them. And how can you blame them? It's a top priority for me. Just as of yesterday, having finally, after a year, found a program that would reduce my COSOP. I also have an eye disease. And I finally, after a year, found a drug company that would actually reduce the cost of my eye drops. And I was so grateful for that. There are life-saving medications, and people are having to make unthinkable decisions about whether to purchase their medications or put food on the table or gas in their car. And the American people are just sick and tired of seeing endless prices increase every year, while our pharmaceutical companies see record profits. And we just need to find a different way. Drug companies often argue that, we've already had a system in which prices are negotiated by health plans and pharmacy benefit managers, and therefore it's not needed for the federal government to negotiate directly. However, I can clearly see that the system as it currently is designed is failing millions of patients in my district and throughout the country. And this legislation that we're talking about today takes really bold steps toward reducing the cost of prescription drugs, and it really will save the taxpayers billions of dollars over the next decade. So let's be clear. It is taxpayer dollars and wages that go towards paying for these outrageous prescription drug prices. And Dr. Sokal, you mentioned in your testimony that you work with the business organizations who are looking to lower the cost of healthcare in the United States. And I'd like to hear about what you've learned through this work. What are some of the challenges that businesses face in affording drugs, and how does this impact workers? And this is a two-part question. Also, how would having a price negotiated by the federal government help those businesses?
Well, let me start by addressing this very important question about how employers are dealing with this problem. And employers and employees, they are in the same boat, because it is very frequent that employers, in their benefit design, they have to charge a certain percentage of the drug cost when a patient needs a certain drug. And that charging that percentage of the drug cost, it is what really is detrimental to patients, because the price that is available to patients when they calculate this cost is always the highest price. And it is different than the price that it is negotiated at the end of the day for the employer. Now, employers would pretty much prefer to have this revenue available to invest on retirement plans, better compensation, to keep their workforce, to offer better benefits. And they aren't capable to when they spend so much on prescription drugs. At the same time, charging a percentage of the drug cost to employees, it is a way to shift the drugs cost and penalize employees when they need a very expensive drug. Having the secretary negotiate these prices on behalf of everyone would allow patients to also reduce their drug costs. The GAO report has shown that other countries, for the same drugs, people pay much less. And it's not that these countries have more money available to cover drugs. It's really that they have better price controls and price negotiations in place. And we can match these prices around the world if we enact certain negotiations like in HR 3.
Well, thank you so much for your answer. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Representative, and thank you for your personal story. The chair now will recognize the gentlelady from Tennessee, Representative Harshbarger. The floor is yours.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Allen and the witnesses. There's no doubt we have to do something in Congress about drug pricing, and we know Americans, that's one of their number one priorities, but they still want access to life-saving medications. And as most of my colleagues know, I've been a pharmacist for 34 years, so nobody on this call has heard more about lowering drug prices than I have over 34 years. And I could talk to you all day if you want to know about PBMs. I'm your woman, okay? Because we deal with those. And I just had a roundtable the other day with independent pharmacies from the district, myself and Buddy Carter, representative from Georgia. And did we get an earful? Because they are putting 2,000 independent pharmacies out per year because they won't even reimburse the price of the medication. So what I really want to touch on is I want to talk about those pharmacy benefit managers. These managers were created as middlemen, and they were supposed to reduce the cost of insurers, validate eligibility, administer drug benefits, negotiate costs between pharmacies and healthcare plans. But what has happened is they've morphed into one of the most highly concentrated, least accountable profit centers in our healthcare industry. The vertical integration from these, the FTC should have looked at years ago, that a pharmacy can buy a pharmacy benefit manager is ludicrous. What has happened? They have enormous power too over drug companies. And I use the analogy that you have the drug company as the parent, and now we have a child down here called a PBM. And now this child has grown up and it's smacking the parents around, telling them what they're going to rebate, what they're going to give them back. So these PBMs do this. They choose what drugs are covered by the insurance. They negotiate purchasing deals with drug makers. They determine the co-pays for the customers and what tiers they're in. They decide which pharmacies will be included in prescription drug plans, and they decide how much pharmacies are reimbursed for the drugs they sell. It's pathetic. In big pharma, the way they price these drugs, it's not even AWP, which is average wholesale price anymore. They made another I don't even know what it's called. It's NADCS or something. It's something made up that the way they reimburse pharmacies and these plan sponsors think they're transparent, and they are not. They're the least transparent. There's things called spread that they have, and they may pay a hospital pharmacy one thing and a retail pharmacy another, and they're at their mercy. It's a take it or leave it mentality when it comes to these independent pharmacies. If they don't take it, they can't stay in business. If they do take it, they're going to go bankrupt eventually. And the bottom line, they've been doing this the last 10 years, and we're to a point to where these independent pharmacies are screaming at us saying, help us. We're not going to survive a year. I have a PBM accountability bill out right now that I want everybody to know about. It's HR 1829. Everybody has an independent pharmacy in their district, and I would implore you look at that. You know, there's three big PBMs, and they control 77% of the market. It's pathetic. So there is no transparency. We need to fix that. But my question is for Dr. Holtz-Eakin. Do you believe the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services have the regulatory authority to implement some PBM reform and transparency policies already with additional legislation? Do you think we can do that?
Well, certainly in recent years, there have been efforts such as the rebate rule, which was an attempt to take the list price and the net price, which is after rebates, and make sure that that got passed through to be the retail price out of which people would calculate their coinsurance, and thus they're out of pocket. And so one of the reasons I went through all those terms in my written is to emphasize that patterns look very different depending on which you use as the measure of price. They attempted to do that. That rule in the end did not get finalized. That would have applied only, however, to government programs. Congress could do something legislatively which applied to the commercial market as well if it wanted to do that. But certainly the notion that coinsurance is calculated off the list price and the net price is what everyone else is operating on is a real source of financial distress for a lot of beneficiaries and a lot of patients.
Absolutely. Mr. Mitchell, as you know, there's a number of abusive and harmful PBM practices, such as the spread pricing, the direct and indirect enumeration fees, where PBMs underpay pharmacists, deny discounts to patients at the pharmacy counter. And there's just so many practices that people need to be aware of. Since our subcommittee has direct jurisdiction over ERISA, I'm wondering what legislative recommendations you have or would support for the committee to take action with.
Well, first of all, as a patient, I find it very disturbing that I can't know if the preferred drug on a formulary is the best drug for me or the least expensive drug for me, or if it's just there because the PBM got a big kickback from the drug company. The headwaters of the problem are high drug prices set by the manufacturers, but everybody downstream is making money too, and PBMs among them. And there's a reason that biosimilars are having a hard time entering the market to compete with biologics. That is because the drug companies negotiate rebate walls and other arrangements to block competition working with the PBMs. So I feel strongly we need to start with list prices, but there's work to do on this issue of transparency and ensuring that PBMs are operating in the interest of the people they're supposed to serve.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have lots of other questions. I'll submit those. I yield back.
Thank you. I really appreciate your perspective and look forward to having a further discussion about your bill and other ideas. I've had a wonderful relationship with Mr. Carter. He's a co-chair with me of the Cancer Survivors Caucus, and we look at these issues. So
fantastic. Thank you, sir.
With that, I will recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No teacher's ever given me a gold star, so I don't know if we're going to start today or not, but
there's always a first.
I'm a two-time cancer survivor like the gentlewoman from Georgia, and I'm in your club and don't wish it on anybody else, but I also have two young adult kids with Crohn's disease who've had it for years. So, you know, this drug price issue has been very personal for my family. Mr. Asalsi, you pointed out in your testimony that rising drug prices are having a direct impact on the kind of health care that patients receive. 1 in 3 Americans report skipping doses of their medication due to cost, and millions of Americans, including my constituents who tell me about it, are splitting pills or taking other steps to stretch out their prescriptions. So my question to you, and I want to get to another one after this, is what impact does this have on patients' health itself and on the costs they face if they eventually do seek care after they forego their medication? And do patients in other countries have this problem? And how do their health outcomes compare to patients in the US?
Thank you very much, Representative Lee, for the question. I think you did a beautiful job of describing in your own district and the reality that so many Americans live with. As you mentioned, about 1/3 of Americans right now cannot afford their drugs and are doing things like splitting drugs. And as I talked about in my testimony, Maureen has made the decision to cut back on food because she can't afford her drugs. So it's a very, very serious problem. We don't, when you compare what's happening in the rest of the world, this is a very uniquely American problem for most of developed, in comparison to most of developed nations. Most families across the developed countries do not have to worry about whether they're going to keep the roof over their head, keep the savings that they've worked so hard to make, and the health of their kids and their family. And that's it's a uniquely American problem, and it's one that needs a solution. You know, and if you think about what's happened just this year with the COVID vaccines, we are in a situation in which the entire regime around the development of these vaccines is what HR 3 would put in place. The government helped to fund the vaccine development. The government negotiated the price, right? And the vaccine is here for Americans. We paid for 100% of the Moderna development, and we paid for almost half of all the other ones. And yet we still have record profits occurring in the pharmaceutical industry. Billions of dollars are going to Pfizer.
And I might point out that the companies are resisting us getting TRIPS waivers so that these drugs can save lives around the world, and we can stop a new variant from developing to come back. Let me get to my second question. In your testimony, you talked about also the need to ensure that all consumers are protected from price spikes, not just consumers covered by Medicare. So let me ask you to talk a little bit more about why that's important in your view, and why doesn't the protection for Medicare consumers confer protection to other consumers like folks with employer-sponsored health care?
Right. Really important question. And to start with, let's recognize that what doesn't make sense is the pharmaceutical industry right now is the one industry that isn't actually subject to the government getting in and saying, is this a fair price? Hospitals live with it. Doctors live with it. There's some reason that we've given pharmaceutical industry a pass, and that's where the abuse comes from. Secondly, there's discussion about this radical idea that we should be internalizing the costs in Europe in our market so that we are not subsidizing the drug costs for other countries. That is something that President Trump proposed and signed an executive order on in July, right? It is not a radical idea. It's something President Trump himself said he was going to do. And then to your point, fundamentally, we know about 150 million Americans are currently getting their health insurance coverage, not through Medicare or Medicaid, right? Those folks are getting their coverage through employer-sponsored insurance.
Which is what we have jurisdiction over.
And that is what this committee works on. And fundamentally, we got to solve this problem for all Americans, not just for the Medicare recipients or Medicaid recipients.
All right. With that, Mr. Chairman, I will earn my first ever gold star. I yield.
As they say, priceless. Next, Chair will recognize the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Miller.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Go ahead. Floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Holtz, for your testimony and for taking time out of your day to share your expertise with the committee. I want to give you an opportunity to clarify your response to my colleague who asked about international access to drugs. I was interested in your response, but unfortunately you were cut off before you could fully answer the question you were asked. So could you answer for the committee, what kind of access countries with policies like those in HR3 have to innovative medicines?
Far less than in the United States, Congresswoman. The sort of typical comparison country in HR3 has at most 60% of the brand name drugs that American consumers enjoy, often only a third or 40%, Australia, places like that. So the answer is often no, they won't have access to that drug. And indeed, one of the characteristics of those countries is they deny their citizens access to the latest therapies and drugs on a regular basis. And the United States does not do that. Now we have issues that I acknowledge in some targeted situations for the financial burden of those therapies, but their value as advances in medical science, I don't think is in dispute. The question is how we're going to effectively finance recovering the costs of developing them.
Yes, and I have another question for you, Dr. Holtz-Eaton. Can you describe how negotiations with the federal government would work under HR3? Would you describe the approach as a fair, voluntary, and market-based price negotiation?
No, I wouldn't. As I mentioned in my oral remarks, we looked at this issue when I was the director of CBO, and it's been revisited many times in the years since. And if we position the secretary as we do a plan under Part D, the secretary couldn't do any better than that plan. The secretary doesn't have a tool, doesn't have a formulary, doesn't have a way to move market share toward the manufacturer and thus get rewarded by a lower price. And so for that reason, the CBO concluded on a regular basis, there would be little impact of providing the secretary with negotiating authority. This isn't that situation. It's not a market-based negotiation. This is a situation where there's by fiat set a maximum price called the average international market price. And then, quote, negotiations begin where the secretary says, I get to decide whether you're negotiating in good faith or you're subject to a tax on 95% of your gross revenues, which is not deductible for income tax purposes, is over 100% effective tax rate, and would effectively close the domestic market to that manufacturer for that drug. That's an enormously powerful government tax weapon being brought to the table, very different than a private negotiation.
Yes, thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Representative. The chair will recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes. Representative Wild.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Susan Wild here from Pennsylvania 7. I hope you can hear me okay. I am in a public place and therefore masked. My question is for Mr. Assassi, and it has to do with an issue that is incredibly important to the people in my district, and that is the cost of insulin. We know that nearly a century ago, the scientists who discovered insulin, rather than seek to profit from it, famously sold the patent for just $1 as a gift to society. And for decades, this life-saving drug was available to consumers at a reasonable price. Yet when I'm home in my district, as I am now, and I'm talking to my constituents, I hear over and over again from patients who are finding that they are struggling to afford insulin. Mr. Assassi, first of all, what is going on here? Why are insulin prices increasing and what is the cause? And if you could comment also on how HR3 would address these insulin prices and ensure that consumers have access to this critical medication.
Thank you so much, Representative Wild, for the question. Such an important one. We hear about it at Families USA all the time. As you mentioned, we've got about 30 million Americans across the country with diabetes. This is their life and death we're talking about. What we know is, as you've said perfectly, insulin was developed over 100 years ago, and the price is continuing to go up and up and up. Between 2002 and 2013, it tripled in price, a drug that's over 100 years old. What we see here is a classic manipulation on the part of drug manufacturers to make small changes to the drug to extend patents, extend patents, extend patents. That's the first thing that happens. The other thing we know for sure is that drug makers like Sanofi and Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk are working very hard to create patent thickets around these drugs. They sue competitors, they stop the biologics from entering in. So this is a good example of the ways in which Our system doesn't have any real competition, period. This is about abusing the legal system, smart lawyers, not innovative drugs. And insulin's a perfect example. And we see examples where literally people have died because they can't get their insulin, right? And so to your question about HR3, this is a classic example where, and as I mentioned previously, currently in our healthcare system, Medicare pays for hospital, Medicare pays for doctors, Medicare pays for devices, and Medicare negotiates a price. It sets a price every time. But for some reason, we've decided that drug companies shouldn't be subject to the same thing we do for the rest of the industry, right? HR3 would let us get in there and let the government sit down and negotiate drug prices on behalf of families to make sure that these families are not being stuck with tripling of prices of a 100-year-old drug.
Thank you so much. Mr. Chair, may I inquire how much time I have left?
Let me check. How much time does the representative have left?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Okay. Thank you, Representative. I'm sorry. The chair would now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Allen, for 5 minutes. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Oh, is Ms. Fitzgerald back?
What about?
Yes. Ms. Fitzgerald, are you back? Ms. Sparts, you're after all the subcommittee members. So we'd go to Mr. Allen first, then back to Ms. Stevens, and then to Ms. Sparts. Mr. Allen, you're recognized.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I agree, this has been a great hearing. And obviously, we really need to examine this from really all directions, because my experience and Dr. Eltz-Egan, I'm told, and I'd like you to give me some feedback on this, but for example, back in the early 2000s, people were complaining about healthcare costs, period, and drug, everything else. And of course, we know today that that this nation pays about 10 times what any other nation pays for healthcare. Now, we also know that we have the best remedies and most innovative healthcare in the world, obviously by evidence of the development of this vaccine, which nobody thought could possibly be done. And you can't imagine the millions of people who would not be with us today if that had not been done. But going back to, say, the Affordable Care Act, the president then said, we're going to lower your premiums and we're going to lower your deductibles. Okay. And I understand that, and this is just the healthcare community talking to me out in my district. I asked the question, I said, so like for every premium dollar and every taxpayer dollar that goes into the Affordable Care Act, how much actually gets back to take care of a patient? And I was told maybe less than 20%. So this is my concern, is when the government tries to control these things, the cost actually escalates, and the dollar value of healthcare goes to Washington, D.C. and not to the patient. I mean, for crying out loud, the Health and Human Services is what now, $1.4 trillion organization. I mean, help me with this. I mean, is the government involvement in the Affordable Care Act driving some of these cost increases?
So a couple of things on that. First, the real reason for premiums being higher is the underlying cost of care has gone up. We're spending a lot more on healthcare itself. Insurance is a means to spread that national healthcare bill around, but it's the bill itself that's the problem. Of that bill, outpatient prescription drugs are 10%, and they've been 10% for a long time. That hasn't gone up at all. Inpatient, particularly Part B, has gone up somewhat in recent years. And these are extremely innovative, small market specialty drugs that I've mentioned before. And they are what stands out as something that Congress should think hard about looking at. I think they are phenomenal medicine, but they are the ones where paying coinsurance on the list price, for example, is probably causing some financial pain. The real bulk of the bill is elsewhere. It's in doctors and in hospitals and other providers. That's where America spends its healthcare dollars. And one of the concerns that I would voice as an economist is that since the passage of the ACA, we have seen considerable consolidation of the provider side of the market, and hospitals buying doctor groups, other consolidation that inhibits competition and leads to higher healthcare costs. And I'm concerned that not just federal, but state level, certificate of need, scope of practice, and a variety of other regulations are in fact getting in the way of lowering our healthcare bill, and that's a problem.
And do you see the same thing with HR 3?
As I think you've probably gathered, I'm not a big fan of HR 3. It does nothing to improve market competition in the United States. It does a lot to damage the futures of those who are faced with catastrophic illness, and I cannot support it.
Tell me about messenger RNA and this innovative technology that developed the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines.
So I think the past year is a fantastic, as I mentioned, a fantastic episode in public policy, but it was preceded by 3 decades of private risk capital attempting to develop this technology unsuccessfully. So this is where lots of money goes. Moderna raised about $5 billion of private capital. They weren't entirely public financed.
And this would not have happened had this been law.
Right.
10 years ago. Okay.
No one would have given them the money.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And thank you for all of our committee members and our witnesses. We really appreciate this information. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. It's always a pleasure. The chair will now recognize Ms. Stevens, a gentlelady from Michigan.
Well, thanks to our chair for his phenomenal leadership and dedication to this issue about lowering the cost of prescription drugs, and also staying firm on what it means to ensure that every American has access to good, affordable health care, something that we achieved when we passed the ACA into law and saw it prevented from being overturned in 2017 and on. Dr. Sokol, first of all, thank you so much for your expertise and your wonderful testimony. As you know, this past year has been devastating for our nation's older adults who have been just clearly disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. We're thrilled to see great rates of vaccinations among older Americans here in Oakland County. We are at 80% of older Americans being vaccinated, but it's also an example of why it is more important than ever to support the well-being of this population who is, just bore the brunt of the drug pricing crisis in our country for far, far too long. So much so that 1 in 5 older Americans report not taking their medication because of the cost. I have had people in my district out at the farmer's market tell me such, that their costs of their prescription drugs are just too high. They're retired, they save, they're living a fine retirement, but they can't pay $5,000 for arthritis medication. So it's part of why I'm pleased to support HR 3, which is gonna obviously improve innovation in our Medicare program to lower the costs of prescription drugs, and a provision that I led to improve the auto enrollment in Part D plan so that beneficiaries front. But Dr. Sokol, just wondering, just based on your incredible research into older Americans' drug pricing preferences, could you speak to how provisions in HR 3 will benefit older Americans in particular?
Absolutely, and it's such a big concern for this population, right? So first of all, older Americans under Medicare, they don't have an out-of-pocket cap right now. And so when taking a drug, and I'll give an example from our research, our number 2 drug in terms of top spending in Medicare Part D was Revlimid, a drug to treat cancer. This drug was already in the US market for 14 years when we did our research. And we in the US, we were paying 10 times more as Japan and 3 times more than the UK for this drug. This is just an example. Other drugs were similar. And the interesting part is that in our calculations, if Medicare Part D were to use the average price around the countries that we studied, just the savings from this price negotiation would amount to about $73 billion. And I mentioned this number because you were talking about vaccination. $73 billion would be enough to vaccinate the US population, more than 2 or 3 times with COVID vaccines today. So it's an incredible amount of money that we are spending and disproportionately more than other countries for this population alone.
And you mentioned, Dr. Sokol, in your testimony that you work with business organizations who are looking to lower the cost of healthcare in the United States. And I'd love to hear what you've learned through this work. What are some of the challenges that businesses face in affording drugs, and how does this impact the workers? How would having a price negotiated by the federal government help these businesses, even though I know we've kind of gotten into this a little bit already in the hearing?
Right. But there is a lot here and a lot of benefits, different benefits to different stakeholders. So let's just take the same example that I used, Revlimid. This is a drug that each pill of this drug costs about $600 in terms of list price, right? Of course, it's much less in terms of final negotiated price, but $600 per pill. If we charge about 20% co-insurance to a patient who needs this drug, and this drug is used to treat cancer, and it's a very important drug for those who need it, the co-insurance on each pill will amount to $120 that the person is going to be paying for each pill that they take. So bringing up a benchmark and increasing transparency would increase transparency and will lower the price in the out-of-pocket side for patients as well. The other thing is, in terms of Me Too drugs, oftentimes employers don't know that they're spending so much money. The price differentials between these Me Too's and their corresponding generics is sometimes generics are 99.9% cheaper than the Me Too. And that transparency would increase the knowledge about that and make decisions more informed, both from patients and their prescribers.
Thank you. I'm over time, and I know Dr. Mitchell too touches on this, so we'll probably just get you for written. But thank you to our chair for this. I yield back.
Thank you, Madam Ms. Stevens, and no gold star for you, but you could aspire in the future. Next speaker is the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Marvin, and then we'll go to our chairman as of the moment, and then Ms. Spartz. Representative Marvin.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate this opportunity, and I appreciate the panel being here and ranking member also. In my previous elected position, I was responsible for assisting individuals who were having a hard time or having an economic crisis paying for medications that were absolutely necessary for their health and the quality of their life. Far too often, they were being forced to make decisions on whether or not they could pay their rent or food, like Maureen, and pay for their medications. It was often a new and innovative drug that they needed in order to perform their work to support their family. And they often needed that employment in order to have their health insurance. Mr. Mitchell and Dr. Sokol, a recent study by the Purchaser Business Group on Health and the Kaiser Family Foundation found that more than 9 in 10 employers believe that the cost of providing health benefits is excessive. What impact does high healthcare costs have on the American businesses, and how can we move forward in a way that improves the ability for those most in need to have the life-saving and sometimes career-saving medications?
So, Marianne, do you want to go first? Okay. About 56% of Americans get their health coverage through their employers. It's a huge amount of money that employers devote to healthcare in this country. It turns out, there was a recent survey, 77% of small business owners support direct Medicare price negotiation. And just yesterday, the ERISA Industry Committee, which is large employers, said that they don't feel that HR 19 goes nearly far enough because the way it's structured, it's going to just shift costs onto employers because it doesn't lower drug prices. So employers around the country are hurting from the burden of high drug prices and trying to manage those. HR 3 would extend the benefit of low prices into the private sector and help all Americans. Mariana, I hope I left time for you.
Let me just add one important thing is the reason why employers are so crucial to this conversation is not only because of the price of the drug. When the patient cannot afford the drug that they need, we already discussed this. One of the consequences is that they are going to increase their medical costs. People are going to start, missing days at work, and employers are the ones who are going to foot the bill for these increased medical costs. So imagine a person taking insulin. If they cannot afford to take their insulin that particular month, they're going to need frequently, a visit to the emergency department, a visit to the hospital. They're going to need perhaps a hospitalization. In long term, not to mention the long-term consequences from those the lack of access to their insulin. And those the spending on those services is going to be paid by the employer. So it's a very important goal to make sure that affordability of drugs such as insulin is met in these cases.
And I just want to reiterate what I'm taking away is the non-compliance based on economical reasons have a cost on healthcare. And ultimately, the next question I have for Dr. Sokol, and I want to get my gold star, is what studies or what information do you have about the choices that older Americans may make when it comes to pricing and medications?
Right. Well, we know that 3 out of 10 Americans have struggled to pay for their prescription drugs, right? And 1 in these 3, they have experienced a worsening of their condition because of that. And earlier we talked about the fact that, so far we have assumed that the government not negotiating in Medicare was not supported, but there is a very strong public support for the government to negotiate. And 60% of Americans would trade off, of older Americans would trade off the option to, choose or change their prescription drug plan in Medicare Part D if they were to get lower drug costs. So there's very strong support for that.
I thank you very much, and I appreciate your testimony today, and I yield back to the chairman.
Thank you. I'm afraid I might be inhibiting good questions by using gold stars as a motivator, but thank you for being timely. I have as the next speaker, the chairman, Mr. Scott. You're recognized for 5 minutes, and then we'll go to Congresswoman Spartz.
Thank you. Mr. Holtz-Eakin, you mentioned increasing supply as a strategy to reduce prices. How do you pull that off with drugs that are protected by patents? How do you increase supply?
Well, certainly there is competition between on-patent branded drugs. I mean, the poster child for that would be Sovaldi, and then the competitors that came on and forced dramatic price reductions in that drug. I think that's the most recent example to point to. In terms of ways that you do that, you certainly want to streamline the approval process to the extent possible. You want to make sure that you have an effective and regular process for the authorization of generics and biologics. Those are things that I think have been an extraordinarily valuable contribution to American medicine and are cheaper in the US than around the globe. And I think making sure that those processes are understood, certain, and executed the same way for every drug is very important.
Thank you. Mr. Mitchell, we're talking about negotiating at a price at 120% the average international market price. At our last hearing, we were told that if it's 120%, that would mean that the biggest market, the United States, would be paying the highest price, so we wouldn't have to worry about people pulling out of the market. But Mr. Holtz-Eakin did accurately cite the CBO report that said that there would only be a negligible effect if all we did is granted negotiation. We would have to do more than that. What more would we have to do to get meaningful reduction in prices along with negotiation?
Well, we have to have an incentive for the drug companies to engage in negotiations, because if there is none, then there will be no savings. Folks today have talked about using international reference pricing as fiat. Well, this fiat is supported and was proposed by the former president of the United States, who is still, near as I can tell, the leader of the Republican Party. And he believes that we should use international reference pricing, not to lower prices, but to get the lowest price of any nation in the world. So I would say that international reference pricing is one of the things that we can use, consistent with former President Trump, in order to help set a boundary for negotiations. And then we have to have a stick to go with the carrot when we negotiate, both. And by the way, carrots and sticks are frequently used in negotiations, both of those things.
Thank you. And Dr. Sokol, a lot of concern has been raised about the fact that if this bill passes, there'll be great savings in the hundreds of billions of dollars, money that could have gone to research, and therefore there'll be fewer drugs created. Isn't it true that if we set aside a portion of those savings to research and the NIH, we could offset that that loss?
Absolutely. The FDA is contributing to every single drug that is approved currently to the drug development. And, of the most frequently prescribed drugs in America, 93% of them have had NIH funding. What the HR3 mechanism of negotiation would possibly do is reduce innovation, so-called innovation for these Me Too drugs. But for the really effective drugs, we would still have the NIH research pushing for these innovative routes, the innovative mechanisms of actions for really innovative drugs.
Thank you. And Ms. Assisi, if this bill passes, there was a suggestion earlier that there'd be a lot of consolidation in the industry. Did you want to comment on that?
Sure. So I think fundamentally the question is, Dr. Hultikin mentioned that the industry's business model would change. It'd stop abusing pricing and their market shares would go down, but somehow there would be a lot of people interested in merging together. The two things don't make any sense. This bill does not increase consolidation in the pharmaceutical industry. That's already happened. We've seen massive consolidation in the pharmaceutical industry already. What this bill does is say, in a very distorted market where there are no real negotiations going on and a lot of abuse, the government's going to get in there and make sure that the American people are getting a fair price.
You know, my great surprise, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, you always get a gold star. All right, the chair will now recognize representative from Indiana. Welcome to the subcommittee. Ms. Spartz, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the time and appreciate the discussion. I share the frustration of a lot of members of this committee. I would probably argue that price and wage controls after World War II, that's what got us in trouble with healthcare. And there are some, issues that in this bill I probably would be agreed. Reform in the FDA, dealing better with substance abuse, better negotiation for Medicare, for seniors, PBM transparency. We need to deal with hospital care, which was over 50% of spending, and have really inflation, hyperinflation of price, I would argue. We also dealt with some issue in antitrust subcommittee that we have to deal. But I have a major concern with House Bill 3. And I'll tell you the major concern I have, and it's particularly dealing where we give an enormous power to HHS secretary to have a very, very powerful tax weapons, to have a requirements to do government reporting and collecting of data, and also, creating models to enforce mechanism of government price control for the group market. And if you look at the group market, it's about, like in the state of Indiana, 90% of the private payers market. So my question is to Dr. Hultikin, wouldn't you think if we're going to have, government control and government takeover over 90% of, private payer market, that would be, something like almost maybe not in its form, but in substance, almost like nationalization of the pharmaceutical market, and it will be closer to communist China in our control than being a free enterprise country. I mean, isn't it like if you look at that, that is a powerful control and centralization of power of federal government, which I understand government can control price and we can do very good, but it's going to be, fatal for innovation.
You've said my concern very succinctly, and this is a sweeping proposed legislation. I mean, it would take over an enormous swath of the pricing of pharmaceuticals in the United States. It would do it in a way that I think is at odds with providing appropriate incentives for innovation. There's always a trade-off in a situation with patents between incentives for innovation and arrival of market competition. I think this goes way too far in the wrong direction and would damage the ability of future citizens to have access to therapies and innovations they need.
If you would just kind of follow up, what would be 3 key things that you think would be actually beneficial that we have more competition on the market versus alternative big government monopoly? Because ultimately we're providing alternatives to oligopolies that be created for a lot of reasons. So I'm not going to debate here. We give an alternative of ultimately government monopoly on the market. What would be better solution if you can highlight maybe 3 issues that we should do better?
Sure, I think 3 things that I would highlight are, number one of the real poster child of the price increases in pharmaceuticals has really been sole source generics, not branded drugs. And to make sure that we do not get abuse of market power with sole source generics, I think will be something that we got to make sure that the FTC and the DOJ are effectively dealing with. So that'd be number one. Number two, use the levers that you can pull, and you can redesign the Part D benefit to protect beneficiaries from catastrophic costs, to improve the incentives to negotiate effectively for lower prices between plans and manufacturers, and to save the taxpayers some money. I'd like to see that. That could spill over as a result to the broader pharmaceutical market, because it's a quarter of pharmaceutical spending. So that's important. And number three, one of the painful situations that arises again and again is this disparity between coinsurance calculated on list prices and the net price that has been negotiated by a PBM or by a plan. And Congress could eliminate that disparity by passing the rebates through to the retail level. It hasn't done that. That's a rifle shot compared to the sweeping thing you have under consideration, but would solve a lot of the problems that you hear about.
Yeah, thank you. And I hope we can agree on some issue and work on some other issues that on the bipartisan way, but I appreciate this discussion and I appreciate being part of this subcommittee, and I yield back.
Thank you so much for joining us. That is the last person that we have questions for. So I want to thank the panel again, really wonderful discussion. I appreciate the content and the tone to a very vexing problem. I want to remind my colleagues that pursuant to committee practice, materials for submission for the hearing record must be submitted to the committee clerk within 14 days following the last day of the hearing. So by close of business on May 19th, 2021, preferably in Microsoft Word format. The materials submitted must address the subject matter of the hearing. Only a member of the subcommittee or an invited witness may submit materials for inclusion into the hearing record. Documents are limited to 50 pages each. Documents longer than 50 pages will be incorporated into the record via an internet link that you must provide to the committee clerk within the required time frame, please. But please recognize also that in the future, that link may no longer work. Pursuant to House rules and regulations, items for the record should be submitted to the clerk electronically by emailing submissions to edenlabor.hearings@mail.house.gov. Again, I want to thank the witnesses, really terrific, good spirited debate and information that helps inform our policymaking. Members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for you, and we ask the witnesses to please respond to those questions in writing. The hearing record will be held open for 14 days in order to receive those responses. I want to remind my colleagues that pursuant to committee practices, witness questions for the hearing record must be submitted to the majority committee staff or the committee clerk within 7 days. The question submitted must address again the subject matter of the hearing. I now want to recognize the distinguished ranking member for closing statement, Mr. Allen.
Rick, you're on mute.
Mr. Allen, are you there?
He's there, but he's having a technical difficulty. There he is.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate
There we
your-
go. Okay.
There we go. The floor is yours.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you for this hearing today. It's shared a lot of enlightenment on this subject. I do ask for unanimous consent to enter in the record a statement from the National Association of Healthcare Underwriters raising concerns with HR 3.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I want to thank all the witnesses for their testimony today. Many of my colleagues today have implied that NIH or the federal government invented the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, or worse, that the U.S. government has ownership or co-ownership of vaccines through patents. These claims are blatantly false. If HR 3 were law before the pandemic, the speedy development of Moderna and Pfizer vaccines would likely not have been possible. To date, over 100 million adults are vaccinated against COVID-19. This life-saving scientific, technological, and this is a life-saving scientific, technological, and logistical feat unheard of in the history of medicine. Again, I remind my colleagues that many Americans are facing skyrocketing healthcare costs because of dramatic increases in out-of-pocket costs of prescription drugs. And we need to do something about it. In 2018, patients paid a collective $61 billion in out-of-pocket drug costs. And we need to come together and on a bipartisan basis and promote legislation that will solve this problem, but not a war on the healthcare industry, like we've had a war on fossil fuels, that now the price of gasoline is almost double. So fortunately, Republicans are stepping up with solutions that work best for the people without the heavy hand of government interference. HR 19, the Lower Cost, More Cares Act, introduced last month by Republican committee leaders, is the exact opposite of HR 3. This is Speaker Pelosi's big government power grab. The Lower Cost, More Cares Act will utilize the power of the free market to modernize our healthcare system, increase choice and transparency, and lower costs. These are goals that both sides of the aisle should be able to rally behind, and the American people demand it. At the end of the day, HR 3 would only lead to fewer treatments and cures, decreased competition in the marketplace, and increased reliance on communist China. Rather than promote partisan socialist policies such as HR 3, I again urge my colleagues to work together on finding a bipartisan solution for lowering drug costs, like the common sense provisions, including in HR 19. Again, what we're talking about here is a government takeover of the pharmaceutical industry. Again, I thank you through HR 3. Again, I thank you and the witnesses for participating today. And with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you again, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. I appreciate your comments. Although we do have a respectful disagreement, I don't see this as a government takeover. As a former small business person, as somebody who's met a payroll many times like yourself, this is a challenge of a mixed market where we do have a good partnership with the private sector, but transparency is important, and a reasonable rate of return that incentivizes investment from the private sector, but still acknowledges the value of taxpayers' investment, I think is important to the indiscriminate bystander. So to that, any of the witnesses, and thanks again to a terrific panel, to all of you, if you have information that helps to quantify this, where the value is and what the incentives are for appropriate, Dr. Holsekin, that what I was trying to get as a reasonable rate of return is also an acknowledgement of what's high risk and what's high return. The hearing we had on oversight when Chairman Cummings was leading this, and his memory, I constantly think of him when we go through this, and the personal discussions we had about our health conditions is it should be high risk, high reward, not low risk, high reward. So somewhere in there, Dr. Holsekin and other panelists, if you can inform me personally as one member of Congress as to knowing this isn't a perfect science, but at least to further quantify how we incentivize that partnership and get it right. You know, and I appreciate the comment about price control in post-World War II, but my reading of history is price control helped contribute to us winning World War II and liberating Europe. So there's a balance here that we're looking for, and I appreciate the respectful disagreement we have, and somewhere in there having a meeting of the minds that helps to remedy the situations that people like myself and Mr. Mitchell and other people who have testified to this and other members is getting that right incentive. I know I had a meeting with my oncologist yesterday, and my cancer is fighting to find a way back to health. So we're looking at other treatments. So this is the right sort of the right temperature of the porridge, if I can use that metaphor. So I appreciate all of this and look forward to ongoing discussion. Again, I want to thank the witnesses. I want to thank my colleagues for really, I thought, a very helpful hearing. And I will go purchase some gold stars so that you get a real reward. Pavlov's dog applied to this subcommittee. Today's hearing to me reaffirmed the urgent need for the federal government to reduce and contribute to reducing the cost of prescription drug prices. All this innovation is only helpful if people can access that innovation and there's a reasonable rate of return for the investor. As we heard from compelling witnesses, Americans across the country are struggling to access prescription drugs they need to be healthy while also weathering this pandemic. No better time to have some solutions to this problem, in my view. Yet we know that prescription drug companies are not charging exorbitantly high prices because of purely natural market forces or because they are investing in research and development, although that is true to a degree. Instead, drug companies are inflating prices simply because they can all too often. Not all drug companies, but too many, in my view. It's time for price gouging of American consumers at the pharmacy counter to end, and transparency for the consumer to flourish. As we continue to recover from the worst public health emergency in our history, our recent history for certain, we should be doing everything we can provide consumers with relief from the weight of unaffordable drug prices. Simply put, medicines are of no use if those who need them can't afford them. In the months ahead, I look forward to working with my colleagues to finally pass the Elijah E. Cummings Lower Drug Cost Now Act and help ensure that people can get the medication they need to stay healthy and thrive and continue Americans' leadership on this issue. If there's no further business, without objection, I want to thank you all again. The subcommittee stands adjourned.